Okay, welcome everybody to the first episode of the Deeper Grassroots Effect at noon on Mondays. We have a new time. We needed our own time and space. We needed to leave that time for people to call in on Wednesdays, and I think that this will work for people as soon as we get all of these glitches worked out. I guess we're doing okay if we're on here within a few minutes of noon, and we learn as we go. I'm really excited to share with you today that we already have one great guest, and we're going to get another one as well. So already with us, we have Ms. Leila McGee-Harvey of Flint, a well-established radio personality, advocate, researcher, author, and so on. And around 12:15, we're going to get water warrior and Detroit general is how we used to think of her, or do think of her in the activist community, Monica Lewis-Patrick, who works for We the People in Detroit on many projects related to water, housing, foreclosure, and so on. The theme of today's show in particular is about the question of who is the city really for? Is it for predators or is it for people? And I'll tell you, when I say predators, what I mean are all of those people who have particular interests in shaping the city to their vision in a way that maximizes benefit to them. Usually it's material benefit. It can also be political benefit. And I think, there's so many ways that we can get at how to think about that. One of the things that is very current for all of us is the ARPA funding, right? Just as an example, we know that $94 million came into the city of Flint. Flint got the second most in ARPA funding of any city in Michigan, second only to Detroit, even though it's not the second largest city. I believe it was 15th in 2020, and it might be even lower now. And the reason that was explicitly stated by Treasury was because of the health disparities, no, not the health disparities, those two, but the general disparities, the inequities that exist in Flint. Basically, the US government, through Treasury, explicitly was recognizing the fact that the pandemic, which is what the recovery funds are to address, that it affected everyone. Everyone took a hit, but people who already suffer from poverty, from lack of access to health, from housing shortage, from a variety of other needs that are usually structurally racist and structurally classist in our society, people who are excluded. That's why all the extra money was there. Yet, as we've seen, and as people have talked about, not a shingle has been put on a roof, not a window, not a doorknob. And so to me, this captures the essence of the idea that you have the people of Flint who are supposed to benefit as taxpayers, who pay taxes in all these many ways, are to benefit from the federal government when it intervenes after a major national emergency, or the pandemic in this case. They are the people who are supposed to benefit. And unfortunately, we see the way that instead, monies are always diverted to the more powerful, to the more well-connected. A lot of favors are being done for people. I want to say one other thing before I jump into it with Ms. Leila McGee-Harvey, and then shortly afterward with Monica Patrick as well. And that is to tell you a little bit about the background of this show. Given that we're at a new time, we might be attracting a new audience. First of all, who am I? I'm Tom Padroni, and I'm an associate professor of curriculum studies and policy sociology at Wayne State University. And that means that I work with people in their very first course when they're on the path of becoming teachers themselves. And then I also work at the graduate level with people who want to become researchers in the educational field. And I do my educational research largely around Detroit and the way that educational policy there, unfortunately, is often organized not in the interests of local people. Detroit has seen some real educational calamities Under emergency management, some of the same emergency managers that you had in Flint, including Darnell Early, he came to us and helped mess up our schools after he played a role in messing up your water. And so the impact was profound. We had 200 of 300 schools closed. Some of them probably needed to be closed, but not 200 out of 300. Sent people, the instability of the state takeover twice, once from 1999 to 2006, once from 2009 to 2016, led to incredible decline in the district, decline in enrollment, decline in the financial position of the district, decline in educational performance as measured by state mandated tests. So that was my original stomping ground, to think about how educational policy in the city was connected to the politics in Detroit that were further pushing out of the city people who had long stayed with the city, had long had commitments to the city, in favor of a new and different vision. I know you talk about the new Flint through a master plan in Flint. We have the specter of a new Detroit, a dual city, one where people like Dan Gilbert put posters in windows of the Detroit that they envision, that have only white people in them, and then claim that that was accidental. But I think enough people got the message to understand the direction there. So for me, after I was involved with Detroit, I started to get connected up with people who were educational activists in smaller, predominantly Black cities, like Saginaw, like Inkster, which lost its district entirely, like Highland Park and Muskegon Heights, which had their school districts charterized after they were given to emergency management. Emergency management handed them over to a for-profit charter company, which also put those districts in complete array. In Muskegon Heights, they shut down the playground. They sold off the kids' playground equipment to try to make ends meet, just like when they were switching your water over to try to make ends meet, supposedly. And then also in Highland Park, the company that was invested there decided that the high school wasn't making enough money. Everyone knows, like, if you ever look at where charter schools proliferate, especially the for-profit ones, they proliferate in K-8. And the reason why is because it's more expensive to educate high school students. So it's a bad investment. And in Highland Park, the company that was in charge decided just to get rid of the high school, to downsize, and basically sent the students to surrounding districts for them to attend high school. I became aware of, as I already mentioned, and Buena Vista lost their districts in their entirety. The state passed special legislation targeting just those two districts. Though in Inkster, when the schools were closed, students were sent to 4 surrounding predominantly white districts where their service needs often weren't met, where they were treated like they weren't very welcome in many instances. But other cities too, Benton Harbor, when Democrats even, a lot of this happened under Republicans' watches, but also under Democrats, when Gretchen Whitmer threatened to close Benton Harbor High School, I and people like me who had begun to work and to connect among various different predominantly Black communities across the state, many of those that I mentioned, we started to realize that the only way to fight back wasn't enough to have the right facts on our side. That was certainly an important part of it, but we also had to know how to build political mobilizations. We learned that it wasn't enough to speak truth to power, that you also kind of had to have an army behind you or a social movement. And so we began to see successes in this coalition building across the state. So for example, in Benton Harbor, working with local activists there, we realized that we could exert real pressure on Governor Whitmer if she came to recognize that it wasn't just 10,000 people, probably most of whom voted for her, in Benton Harbor that she was antagonizing and alienating, but that people were upset about that all across the state. When the state went after Inkster under Snyder, there weren't many people that came to the Inkster's rescue. But when Benton Harbor happened, people responded from all over the state. Busloads came from Detroit and from the various other cities that had already been afflicted. So when Whitmer traveled around the state, she was confronted with the fact that she had promised to respect local predominantly Black elected governance, that she had opposed the emergency manager law. And people were asking her wherever she went in Michigan, what are you doing in Benton Harbor? The Detroit political class became concerned about it. And that's when it started to become meaningful, I think, to Gretchen Whitmer, that she started to realize that there was a bigger price than she thought that she was paying for threatening to close that high school. And eventually, we know that Governor Whitmer had, and probably still has, national political ambitions. When organizations like the Urban League and the NAACP and others at a national level began taking notice and asking, what is she doing? Why is she picking on this little Black community on the west side of the state of Michigan? That is when she relented. And we began to realize that that's really what we need to do. And that is also the premise for the show. It's the premise for why I became involved in Flint politics for about the last year as well, because I realized that I'd connected with many predominantly Black cities, but I had not connected yet in meaningful ways with Flint. And I also then view this platform, which I am so thankful to 810 News Media Group, to Mickey Wintis and the others for welcoming me to have this show to bring in guests. I view the purpose of this show to help solidify those connections. And that's a large part of what our shows have been about. We've had in great people from many of those cities that I just mentioned. And that's what we're doing again today. That brings us to today. What we're going to be who we're going to be hearing from today are people who are familiar with the context of what the direction of the city is and whose vision is being actualized for the city, comparing Detroit with Flint. And Mickey, I just have a text. I apologize, technical difficulties for a moment. I have a text from Monica Patrick, and she is having technical difficulties. Mickey, I'm going to text you her phone number. If you would call her, can you do that, please? Let's see.
Yeah, I can do that, Dr. Trony, because I just was in her messenger, told her to accept my friend request so I could send her the link. That's what I was back here doing. Yeah.
If you don't mind, would you reach out to her, because she's
I got it.
She's struggling. Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And for people who are paying attention, thank you very much for hanging by while we work out the glitches. Hopefully this will be something that will get easier every time that we do it. We appreciate your patience. All right. So let's start to dive in, and we hope that Monica Patrick will be joining us in a moment. If for some reason she can't, we know that we can have an incredible conversation even without her presence. The fact that she was potentially going to join us was sort of the icing on the cake for this show. So, Ms. Leila McGee-Harvey, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I know what a busy person you are. I know that I've been lucky. I've probably been obnoxious with my persistence in trying to get you here. And it's only because I have heard you speak, and you have spoken so powerfully to some of the issues around inequity in Flint, particularly. I know you also think beyond Flint, but and I know that your experience includes but goes well beyond the water warrior days, that you are very much someone who is paying attention to and who is able to clarify for the public exactly what is happening within the city of Flint, which also might suggest for us ways that we can resist it and push for an agenda for people that is more friendly to the old Flint and not just the new Flint. So if you don't mind, Ms. Leila McGee, would you, Ms. Leila McGee-Harvey, let me get it right, will you please introduce yourself and tell us about your history of involvement with issues related to the right of the people to have access to quality housing, water, access to healthcare, transportation, in essence, to full participation in the life of this city.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me, for even reaching out and your patience with my schedule. I'd also like to give thanks to 810 for having me here and being a voice also in our communities. It is so needed. And I was listening to you, and you just hitting it on the head as relates to all of the issues that we are impacted with. When I try and speak or to implore the community to follow our paths or to listen, right, to have this pristine, turn on their pristine listening ears, I try and help the community to come along, because we're dealing with what you call a continuum of issues, a continuum of strategic and structural systems. And so I like to begin in the etymology so that people understand what's really happening, as opposed to diving into sometimes the issue that is before us today, but we really don't understand. You know what I'm saying? It's Genesis. And so if I can, just for a minute,
Please.
I'd like to just take the time to remind everybody where we are in America and how we arrived, because everything that happens today is predicated on a system that was set up years ago. And so a lot of times we talk about the ending of slavery, but it was the 100 years after slavery that was critical, right? And what I mean by that is the Jim Crow days, right? After slavery and the Jim Crow days that people really don't talk about today. But it was in those particular time, in those 100 years, that we were beginning to define and carve out what our school systems would look like across America, what housing would look like across America, what the health organizations would look like after America. It was at that time when we were under the Jim Crow era, and they were defining, I think we had in 18, if I go backwards, we go right after slavery, but 1869, Plessy versus Ferguson, that said, hey, it is legal. It is legal to live separately, be segregated, right? As long as we were equal. But how could you be equal coming out of slavery, right? And being ran off your land. And so on that premise alone, America was developed, right? Because it was not until the Civil Rights Act that some of that was undone, per se. So as we moved from the Plessy versus Ferguson, and we moved on into, I think it was President Roosevelt, if we remember, under Hope, right after right after the stock market crash. He developed Hope, which is a homeowner organization to help people with their homes, and they were buying the government homes to make sure people had it. Well, in that covenant, Plessy versus Ferguson, there was a covenant. We couldn't have access to those homes. We couldn't get the loans. We couldn't get anything, right? So we move a little further, because right after then, you had FHA created.
Yes.
Years after that was created. But under there was still the same covenant, restrictive laws, that the patterning of housing being left out, people of color being marginalized, right? Gentrified, and no access to home ownership, to health, to schools, because of this constitutional ruling by the Supreme Court. And so even after we moved past that act, you turn it around, and here we are, and we're faced with the 1969 Highway Act, 68 Highway Act under Johnson. And you think, oh, wow, that's great, because that was the onset of HUD, right? But what they created was urban renewal. And James Baldwin always spoke about that meant it was the removal of colored people, right? And because we said that, let's go back, I forgot about FHA, because FHA was created right after Hawk was FHA. And the same covenant there, the same practice there, the same laws that are inoculated there. And we're talking on a national level, right? And then we move from FHA into HUD. HUD is created in the 60s. And what HUD did was HUD turned around and said, look, let's create an urban renewal plan. And what they did was, wherever African Americans were relegated to, no matter where you were in Black Bottom, Detroit, or you were in Minneapolis, you were in Chicago, or you were in the city of Flint on 475, they took highways and came down and dismantled the entire area where African Americans were, right? When we had the opportunity, and we had our own schools, we had our own homes, we had our own businesses, we were economically sound, and we were doing some things for ourselves. Well, they said, let's undo this with what we call urban renewal all the way across So I'm wanting people to see that this is a pattern of national, not just some isolated incident. And this is why you can take Flint and mimic and put it over Detroit. It's the same. It's the same over Chicago. It's the same in Rosewood, Florida, everywhere that you go, right? Because you have patterns of national patterns of structural systemic systems that we said were tore down, but they're still in place, right? And so now what we have in what you talked about was, where are we at when it comes to all of these dollars coming in the city of Flint? Well, HUD has a new program now. I don't know if you're aware of it. And it's to undo the urban renewal that destroyed the lives. It's a new plan to take now and tear down the very system, the very highways that you put through our communities, tear them down. And what we'll do is we're going to use that land and we're going to give it to either a land trust or a land bank, right? And we ultimately know who owns our land bank. And so the reason why I wanted to give that premise is that we have to understand is, and I'd like the listeners to understand that you're not dealing with a new system. You're dealing with the old antiquated system that was flawed from the premise. Now, if we move from a national perspective and we go to a state and local perspective, we're talking about in 2017, where Berkeley in California did research and said Michigan, based on its housing patterns, its school, its educational systems, and everything, was the most segregated state in America, right? Michigan in 2017. If you Google right now as you sit, the city of Detroit is the most segregated city in America in 2024, right? And then we have to say, well, if the 1964 Civil Rights Act undone all of that, if all of the marches that we did, where are these people? They are invisible in plain sight, right? Even through my work, I talk about racism today. It's like carbon monoxide. You can't touch it. You can't smell it. You can't even see it, but it slowly suffocates you because you're dealing with these old antiquated systems. And so even when we talked about the Plessy versus Ferguson, when we talked about living separate, the premise of Charles Stewart Mott, who was a very brilliant man. I studied his life, a very brilliant. I have a strong adulation for how brilliant he was, but he was flawed. He was flawed on the premise that he was a segregationist. He was a racist, and he believed in a separate community. He believed that people of color should be on one side and they should have access to the other side. He created this whole community on that premise. As a matter of fact, we have to remember that at the time that he was creating and serving downtown as our mayor, and he was creating housing patterns with Hulk, FHA, and HUD that I already said had a racist and strategic covenant there, he was also doing it in the city of Flint simultaneously. So all of the programs that were set, they had those covenants. All of the schools that were set, they had those covenants. All of the housing, they had the same covenant, right? And so here it is that even when he was creating the foundation, my foundation, there's a charter that you put in place, and that charter mirrors what? The founder's ideology, right? And do you believe he sat there and said, I want all of my money to go to people of color? And he was a segregationist and a racist? No. And that's why when he created the foundation, if you look around our community today, and I'm coming to today now, if you look at our community, the tentacles, their hands have been in everything. And so they had to create GMI. They had to create Flint Trust, which is now called Community Foundation. They had to create the DDA. Most people don't even know they gave Dan Kildee, who was the treasurer at that time, the money to open up the land bank, which was a racist tool to deal with the migration, the white migration of whites who left Flint, that was created for 200,000 people and went to the suburbs because of the covenant. We will not live among them. We will stay away from them. We don't have to live with them as long as we're equal. And we never became equal. That's the illusion, right? And so these covenants are still in place. The systems were never tore down. And so every time money is allocated, whether it's to Detroit or Saginaw, no matter where it is, and you have the same construct. And so we get most people don't know. I did the research on Mott Foundation. And one of the reasons why is because I got locked out of court. And I had a civil case in the city of Flint. I was actually the first African-American CHOTO, which is certified through housing, through HUD. And I kept trying to figure out why would this judge lock me out? I didn't know who the judge was. Fast forward, it was a system of friendship, right? Of, let me say, don't allow them to do this, do that, or whatever. Move forward, tear that system down. And what I did is I started doing the research. And what I realized is even with the emergency manager, when he came in, remember we were under 72 and 101. Those were not lethal laws. But there was a foundation called Prima Civitas. I don't know if you were familiar with that. Prima Civitas, completely 100% funded by Mott Foundation. Completely funded by them, which they hired Mike Brown to serve as a director. And his job was to find a way to bring urban renewal and development to urban community. And so it actually, I think the start date of it, the genesis date was February 11th, 2011, if I'm not mistaken, or 10, somewhere around there. What's really interesting is as he went in and he was using this funds to find out how do we come into urban areas, right? And how do we come in and redevelop those areas? Because what had happened is that because of the great white migration, because of the color of our skin, right? These broke, fragmented communities of color that were left abandoned because there's not enough people for the school, there's not enough people for the municipality, there's not enough people for the housing. How do we come back? So you create racist tools like the land bank, right? Which was struck down by the Supreme Court and said it's unconstitutional, it's equity theft in July 17th, I think, 2020. And we had been hollering this for a very long time. And you use all these racist tools. So what I began to see was the pattern, even with Prima Civitas under Mike Brown. He was put there to create a pattern and to give them the formula to how to come into urban areas in the state of Michigan and redevelop them. And it was interesting that as soon as Governor Snyder took office, he said, hey, that's the guy. That's the guy that's going to be the emergency manager for the city of Flint, a guy who only has a degree in counseling, who has never had a degree in finance. He also selected a guy by the name of Ed Kurtz, who had been our emergency manager before. Now, I can't even find secondary education on him, not to mention in finance. And so when you have a financial emergency, you're going to bring in a counselor? You're going to bring in somebody where you can't find the secondary education? But it was more than that. It was about the systems that I talk about. And it was about making sure and ensuring that they were going in the direction that we wanted. So I said to you, mentioned to you about going back to Plessy versus Ferguson and the antiquated system that is still in place that people don't like to talk about. And it has actually driven and carved out all of the compliances, the policies for schools, for HUD, for FHA, for whatever we have, for ARPA funds today, for the water settlement, for everything that we have. And so nothing really ever trickles down because you have a construct that's over you, right? That entails that you will never, ever arrive or seek these dollars because they are under the same covenant. Yeah. And so a lot of people don't like to have these conversations, but how do you begin to rectify a system that was created on a flawed premise and injecting different, and we can tell not by me saying this, but by HUD, who says now, oh, we got it wrong when we created the urban renewal. We destroyed a whole lot of lives. Let's fix this problem now with a new system. But nobody ever comes in to sit and talk with us and ask us what is best for us. How do we mitigate through this? And I'm going to say this and I'm going to close out, is that even in the state of Michigan, being one of the most segregated states in the community, you had a governor who, what I call a Nazi form of government, which is to take public assets and privatize them, right, for greed. And of the 1.4 million people of color who lives here out of almost 10 million in the state of Michigan, you have there's 83 communities and townships, and we only comprise 11 of those. And of the 11, the emergency manager goes into 6. And why did that happen? It's because when we began to migrate from the South, I think it was about 86.5% of us came from the South, all over the East and the North, to come out of the fields. When we arrived here and people they could not live by you. Why? Because there was a covenant in place. There's a covenant, redlining, your insurance is going to go up. Your appraisal is going to go down. So they have to take off. My kids can't go to school with you. A lot of people don't even realize that the magnet program wasn't because your kid was smart. The magnet program in Flint, the magnet program in Detroit and Saginaw was because they were now the racial disparities that was in our schools, and they had to integrate the school systems. Most people don't realize my foundation gave $5 million every year to our school system until the end of the lawsuit of Health, Education, and Welfare, 1980. It was actually resolved, and they had to integrate the schools. And that's when you start getting the busing and all the kids going to different schools, because you had to have the white kids and black schools together, or they couldn't get funding anymore. And that was the last time they ever gave $1. Because you know why? You had the covenant when his father set the foundation up. You can't go to school with these people. And so they're invisible in plain sight. And what happens is that when you are large enough and prodigious enough to look benevolent and to give pony rides and to give parks and to give amusement rides to people, or to give plaques and lunch, then it looks like, they're so giving. But what it is the structure and the system and the direction that they have is no different, right? It's taking public assets and privatizing them. The thing all the way across the state of Michigan, when these families began to move out away from people of color, they left behind assets. They left behind railroads. They left behind streets and curbs and water authorities and different things like that. And so what do you have? You have a community, a racist state who says, I'm not buying my water from a completely colored community anymore, which is Detroit. We're going to create our own water authority on the west side of the state of Michigan. We want to be absent. We don't want to have to deal with the city of Flint anymore. And how do you begin to break Detroit's water authority? A lot of people don't know. You have to first break the city of Flint from its water authority. And it was under emergency manager and emergency manager Mike Brown and Ed Kurtz, where you will see where the water gouging began to take place. It didn't take place when Bean was there and Watling was there. It didn't take place then. It took place afterwards. So you would have a reason to break Flint from Detroit, so that when you took Detroit into bankruptcy for the water authority, they didn't have a customer. They didn't have the monies that they had before. And so again, we're talking about structural and systemic systems. We're talking about the balancings of books. And so when you look at the state of Michigan, Michigan has more highways, more bridges, more schools than a lot of other communities, because they don't believe in integration. They believe in segregated communities. And so when by the time Governor Snyder takes over, he's like, how do we balance this book? We're going to keep cutting this taxpayer revenue from colored. We're going to regionalize the city of Flint. We're going to regionalize Detroit. We're going to bring them under, right, the counties and regionalize them, except the lead leached. And it didn't allow them to. That's the only thing that saved us, was the lead leach. So it was a curse and a blessing at the same time. And so what happens is that I like to tell people, when you talk about today, and you mentioned the $94 million in ARPA funds, you're talking about the same antiquated systems. You're talking about people who have racist ideologies and are invisible in plain sight. And so where are these people at? If the state of Michigan has been declared the most segregated and racist city in America, and Detroit, where are the people at? How do they look? Why don't we see them? They're not burning crosses. How do they look?
Right. Beautiful.
They're everyday, mundane individuals that you sit next to, that you accept awards from. And they are the ones keeping this old antiquated system in place. So how do you create, or what do we do as grassroots type individuals in terms of inoculating a plan into a system that's already flawed? How do we deal with that system? What do we do? Where do we go? And so I think what you're seeing now is a lot of individuals, and we have to be careful. And I want to say this, I know you have the doctor coming on as well, which I'm privileged to be able to share this opportunity with you guys. And I know I'm saying a lot, but I like to give the leader, the listeners, an opportunity to understand that it's not an isolated incident when you talk about the ARPA funds. When you talk about policy and law, it's embedded. And so I always say, especially on my weekly show, is that you're not going to hear white power. You're not going to see the hangings. You're not going to see all the crosses and the burnings and all of that. What you're going to see is an ink pen with laws and policies and compliances that will keep us further divided, that will keep us marginalized and backwards. That's what you'll see. And so those are the things that we have to tear down and negate, because if we do not, then it continues. So I wasn't shocked about the ARPA funds. I wasn't shocked about the $1 billion that came in for the water settlement. Mm-hmm. And first thing, the foundations jump up and they're all in charge and all. I wasn't shocked. You know, you put the money over to the side and you make money off the interest. And we know the game. Some of us know the game. Some of us are in the money game, right? And, you know, in the markets and stuff. And so we understand the games, but we understand that it's always operate from a profit for, and I'm going to say this too, is that the understanding and the psychology that I have received and come to understand is that a lot of these systems operate from a fear of lack, right? And fear. Lack that there's not enough for everybody to have, that the creator is not infinite in giving, and fear. Fear of the analogy I use is the husband who has beaten his wife and abused her. So he one eye open. Fear that if she ever gets her own job, she's going to leave him. So he makes sure she never does get a job. Fear. And this is what America and even our local community has. Detroit has their own story, but at the end of the day, they're all the same story.
That's right. That's right.
And they all come from the genesis of the long trail I gave you about Plessy versus Ferguson and us not being living separate. And so you still have the same shared ideology about that as well.
It's beautifully stated. Thank you. We're so lucky to have the depth of your analysis present here. It's so important for me to hear. And let me start off with some points that I'd like to make in relationship to this. And I've been saying in the chat that if people have a question they want to ask, please don't hesitate to put it in. I'll try to keep one eye on that as well. And maybe if Mickey sees a question there, he can share it up as well. But since it looks like we may not be blessed with Monica Lewis-Patrick today with the technical difficulties, maybe we'll see her again soon, but I'm going to represent Detroit a little bit just because it is my area of research. And so I understand a lot of the connections that you've already alluded to, and I want to unwrap them a little bit because they might, hopefully what they'll lead us to is a question of how do we effectively push back? Knowing these broader structural issues, the continuity, that this is not surprising us. How do we effectively push back as a grassroots community? But let me start here. First of all, the picture about the foundation's involvement is exactly the same in Detroit. I mean, it's different players, but it's similar foundations who are themselves networked together, whether it's Skillman or many of the people that have worked together with them. They've played a prominent role in Detroit. And you could look at other cities across the United States, Chicago, Houston, and so on. The same story is taking place there. It is a consistent story that is not just happening in Flint, but it's happening all over the United States. And it's fundamentally a story about displacement, mainly of low-income people of color, away from the potential wealth that someone sees in the remnants of the city and what white people a while ago left behind. And that's a historical piece that I want to raise as well. And I've written about this in some of my publications in relationship to Detroit, is you got to think about the irony of this. Basically, you have a situation in which a lot of developers are realizing in places like Detroit, Chicago, Flint, name all of them, that there is actually incredible potential wealth locked into the city. But certainly in a place like Detroit, and I'll speak more directly to Detroit now, the realization was that precisely because developers had been so successful at generating wealth through exacerbating playing off white fears and exacerbating white flight, engaging in processes not only like redlining you mentioned, but also blockbusting, where you parade Black families in a neighborhood claiming whether they really are or not that they're moving in to scare white folks. And you basically have a process where what we call the urban growth machine, which is financial capital linked with real estate and real estate capital and real estate interests, that you have this incredible potential to make money. And the way that you made money in the heyday of white flight was you got those white people who were leaving to sell really low because they were like, we got to get out of here now. The neighborhood's falling apart. So they would sell really low at the same time that Black folks who actually could move into these neighborhoods, and remember, they had been previously crowded into particular districts, which for reasons that you've laid out with the covenants and so on, they couldn't get out of. So in Detroit, Black people lived in particular areas where overcrowding became rampant, where prices were exorbitant because there was so much competition for such little space, where units were dilapidated because wealthy landlords knew that they would get renters no matter what because there was such a high demand. So when those folks were able to get a foothold in what had been predominantly white neighborhoods, they had to pay a real premium in order to get there as well. So you have money being made at each of these junctures, both in the use of white fear, white racist fear, pushing people out of the city. And of course, that took the tax base out of the city as well. People were also making similar money on the suburban end, right, where whites had access to government subsidized loans to develop suburban spaces. And you have to think about all of this is not just about the market, but as you've pointed out, it's also about the government subsidizing all of this. So you were talking about the creation of I-475 and the way that it was put through Black cultural districts of the city. This happened everywhere. Always through Black cultural quarters, Black business quarters, and Black residential areas. You don't need to drop a bomb like they did in Tulsa to destroy Black Wall Street if you do it through policy like urban renewal. You destroy it and then you claim that Black people don't have an entrepreneurial spirit. Yeah, right. In Detroit, as we know, Detroit had one of the most, just like Flint did in the St. John's area and other areas, a very vibrant cultural and business center. Paradise Valley and then the residential area, Black Bottom, were the Black areas of town. And the amount of culture, of art that was developed there in Paradise Valley, every jazz musician that you could think of performed there, all the great blues musicians, so much went through there. And it was destroyed through the building of I-375, and there was other destruction that happened because of the building of other interstates. And those themselves, so it was development that took place at the cost of already mostly lower income Black folks, so that we could build freeway systems so that whites could quickly get out of the city and back to the suburbs and take their tax base with them, but still come into the city quickly, get out quickly to make profits. Now, the thing that happened, this is referring to that chugging out of everyone into the suburbs of white folks. This growth industry, this urban growth machine, it makes the most money when people are moving. Every time they move, and when you sell your house, there are people, the banks and the real estate companies, they're the ones who are making the money on both sides of the transaction when you sell and then when you buy somewhere else, right? So the analogy is easy to understand. So there was an interest in, a lot of people who were outside of Detroit thought this notion was crazy, that you could unlock value in the city of Detroit. People would say, they got 10 years ago, or maybe 15 years ago, people were saying, you can buy a house for $500 in Detroit. And people say that about Flint too, I know. And so the idea seemed crazy. But, I remember there was very explicitly a campaign that said, you know what, people in the suburbs, people who have money, they want to return this to the city. They have nostalgia for the city. They miss the walkable spaces of the downtown. They miss that urban quality of life that they don't have in the suburbs. They miss the great architecture, which Detroit has some amazing architecture. It's one of the the highest proportion of quality architectural buildings in the United States, with some of the top names that are known in the field of architecture, the biggest names. But you've got a problem. White people, and maybe you could even just generalize with people with a lot of means, don't want to go and live there in Detroit. So in other words, the very thing that you mobilized to chug people out of the city, this vision of portraying the city as a nightmare space for white people out in the suburbs. We heard countless tales about fathers who would be like, if you drive in there to Detroit, you're going to get killed. And if you don't get killed when you're there, I'm going to kill you when you come home for venturing into Detroit. So that's the idea that people had around Detroit. But you had these interests who were like, no, we got to, even in that context, we got to still pull money out of this, right? And so, one thing that I've written about is how closing down of the schools is part of the process of erasing Black identity in the city, especially since people very much identify, particularly with their high schools, as important identity markers. You have to erase a lot of markers of Black space in the city in order to bring people in, make it feel safe. What you're basically doing is and the land bank is a crucial instrument in this, is you're trying to create new green spaces in the city. Just like in the suburbs, you had green spaces that people were moving into, right? Farmland into the suburbs. You want to do the same thing in cities like Detroit or Flint. You want to create new green spaces. And that's for a couple of different reasons. One is to erase the Black identity markers that currently exist there. You want as much as possible erase and maybe romanticize, to the degree that there's any residue at all, what that was that you're leaving behind. So you want to erase that. And then you also want to create green space, because people who are going to invest from a distance, people who are investors, say in California or even in China, they don't want to have to go through the trouble of gentrifying an area by looking at it building by building. Like, does this house, can it be fixed? Can it be salvaged? No, what they want to do is they want to do larger scale developments. And to do that, they want to be able to do it without having to pay close attention to the ground. So they want green spaces. They may not be developed now, but they're being, oftentimes in Detroit, I see as big as Detroit, is they're being mothballed for future development. So let me bring us back to Detroit for just a minute. In Detroit, I can't point to the irony, and you mentioned this in relation to Flint, of the fact that now there are funds to remove I-375. Oh, that was a mistake, now we're going to pull it back up. And people hear that, and if they're naive, they're like, oh, they're finally paying respect to Paradise Valley and to Black Bottom. No, they're not. They're not paying anyone reparations. They're not opening up that space to move you back in and restore to you what they took away from you. They're using your crushed past to sell the space. They are selling that vision of, oh, this is so cool. This is where Paradise Valley was.
But let me interrupt you too, and just say this, is that this is why it's critical when I took the path back down history lane, because we're talking about a organization called HUD that is supposed to protect us, but it is a part of the process. You got me? And so it's important that we understand we're not just talking about isolated, we're talking about a national campaign that further says, I'm here to ensure the betterment of people of color or melanated people, minorities. But in fact, you're doing the same thing you were doing in the onset of your creation, which was back in the 60s.
Yes.
So I just want to make sure that, and what you're speaking about as it relates to Detroit is privilege. Yeah. At the end of the day, it's called privilege.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, we have to, when I was listening to you talk about the green spaces, because that's one of the words that the new policy for HUD has is green spaces, right? Because attached to the green spaces, they talk about the earned money that you'll have by commercial centers and all of that. And even if you look downtown now, a lot of the elitists are putting people in apartments, but they're using the space down to put in the Secretary of State for Commerce and all of these different things with green spaces all the way around it, because the income levels of that property, they go up. And so we have to understand that all that we're speaking about in 2024 mimics 1869. Nothing has changed. The players have changed, but they're still the same shared ideology. And some of us who believe that there is a freedom in these systems when in fact there are not.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that leads us to what I think is the most important question with 5 minutes left. And Mickey, I would really appreciate it. I'm able to glance over at the chat, but there may be questions there and I'm missing them. If there are, can you please post them up so that we can see them too and perhaps answer them? What I want us to speak to in the last 5 minutes that we have is, how do we build resistance to this? How do we build truly democratic movements within our cities, truly anti-racist, anti-predatory movements? Because that's what it is I view it as, people have called it racial capitalism. Race has played an extremely important role, always has, always will, in relationship to capitalism. These two things fit together very well. The white supremacism is always a piece of what's happening. Race is always playing a vital role in these things. So how would you start out, Leila, particularly in talking to Flint, but also thinking about cross cities? How do we resist this?
You know, it's, for me, in all of the research that I have done, it's a twofold, right? Because this conversation we're having is really much deeper. It's layers of it. And so when you speak from a perspective of being an African American, there's layers to being fragmented and broken from structural systemic racism. And so when you get the illusion of inclusion where one was granted, so my thing is that in the community, the one who's Black and who raises his fist and say, Black power, we're moving, we're fighting, let's go, and he's the loudest, that's the one you run from. If you can't run, you crawl, right? Because he's at the table of the very people we're talking about who are oppressing us.
Yep.
And then you have the one who has the suit on, right? Who has been given access and granted access to some of these systems, who now has shut the door, right? He's on the stage. And so the illusion is that we're all are included, but we're really not. And so that's why I say this is much deeper from a perspective of being melanated, because integration, when I was listening to you, how the wealth and the music and everything, integration stole a whole lot. And those are kind of conversations we don't have. Yes. And so the blueprint for me in terms of that is, how do we mobilize with regal people who are interested in moving us forward? You know what I'm saying? Because now it's tricky. You can't just sit at the table with everybody. You know what I mean? You just can't. And so, but we still have to have an answer for that, right? So for myself, I will say, and then I'll let you close the show out. For myself, I'll say, and my team, is that because we've had the opportunity to take a glimpse into all of the players in Genesee County and the city of Flint, i.e. many of them looking like us, did worse than white folks did, right? Because the fragmented nature and the psychosis of racism breaks you. And so I'm either going to sell you out to have access and advancement for myself, or I'm either going to reject you and put up the fist and say Black power, but take your $5,000 grant, right? So you really don't have a voice. You're there to spy and to come in. And so we've taken the approach we've done some things on our own where we're very independent. And so I don't have to sit at the table with these people, but we do have to mobilize, and we have to try and bring people along, because there is no person who can do all of this work. But now it's almost like you're walking across the river and you're trying to figure out who's who, because the whole landscape of the Black Power movement has changed.
That's
You
right.
know, and I'm just telling you that as an African American, it has changed, but we still have to have the answers for that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's beautiful, and it makes me think about the first time I ever spoke at City Council. I called out a city councilman who I won't name right now, who seemed to not understand at all the racial history and present of Flint in terms of what had been done and what was still being done. And his response to me was that what I was laying out was nonsense because, look, we have a Black mayor, we have a majority Black city council, we have a Black police chief. And so the argument was Black folks are in control. And this gets to, I think, your point about understanding maybe the psychosis, but also the division, the way that people who have fought for little bits. And we're going to have to unfortunately leave it there because it's 1 o'clock now. And I want to again express my appreciation to you, Ms. McGee Harvey. I hope that we have future conversations. It feels like we just got our feet wet.
We just got started, right? Because this thing is layered, like it is layered, you know, and there is no particular right answer, you know, or wrong. It's brainstorming and being as creative as we can. And I want to thank you for having me, as well as 810. Thank you so much. And I am, you know, just exceedingly excited to have been here. And it is my hope, my sincere hope, that we were able to leave a word with someone to help to think differently, be better, as I always say, and that we left them in a better position today than they were when they joined.
Exactly. And yes, thank you, 810. Mickey, the greatest producer ever. We all know it. Thank you, Winters. Thank you, everyone at 810 who made this show possible. All right. I'll see everybody next week at noon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.